Hitler argued that gymnastics and sports in schools should be given at least 2 hours a day, with special attention paid to boxing. And of course, all this is to make the young men ready to serve in the army. Hitler himself, as they say now, led a healthy lifestyle, as he ate vegetarian food, hardly ever drank alcoholic beverages, and even in his youth he quit smoking. Then he explained that it was to save money, because he lived poorly at the time, and because he smoked cigarettes, sometimes he didn't even have money for food. So he threw the cigarettes into the Danube. And he stopped smoking forever. But witnesses note that Hitler himself lacked physical fitness, did not pay enough attention to it, and looked quite ill. According to Hitler's plan, only after completing compulsory military service could young men. After that, the young man received a diploma for the right to engage in public activities and the right to marry. Only after military service. Moreover, Hitler naively believed that early marriages, which he actively promoted, were a guarantee against prostitution and venereal disease. They say that if young people get married very early, they will not need to turn to prostitutes, and, accordingly, there will be no such spread of venereal diseases. At the same time, he somehow completely lost sight of the fact that very early marriages often end in divorce. But, of course, from Hitler's point of view, only physically healthy people with beautiful bodies should marry in order to give birth to physically strong, beautiful descendants. And as he wrote, in no case should racial mixing be allowed. The purity of blood was a concept that Hitler constantly used, and he convinced everyone that the Jews wanted to pollute the blood of the Aryans, which would lead to a rapid decline in the quality of the race, its degradation, and complete decline. Moreover, the fact that a person was born in Germany, in Hitler's view, did not mean that he or she was a German citizen. In any case, not by birth, citizenship must be obtained and earned to a certain extent. A person, even if he or she is a pure German or German, simply because he was born in Germany, he has no right to vote, cannot vote in elections and cannot participate in them. To become a citizen, a German had to go to school and then perform compulsory military service. And then take a solemn oath of allegiance to the state and the people. But women, he wrote, can only obtain citizenship after they get married. And only in exceptional cases. Unmarried women can obtain citizenship for great labor merit. In addition, criminals, traitors, or even just wimpy and dishonest people. I wonder who will determine the degree of this wimpiness and dishonesty. All these people can lose their citizenship at any time. As already mentioned in the NSDAP program, Jews could not have German citizenship at all, and this would be implemented by the Nazis in the infamous Nuremberg racist laws of 1935. In addition, Hitler considered all Marxist leaders to be Jews, with all the ensuing consequences.
All human culture is the result of the creative activity of an individual. The destructive activities of the Jews are reduced to an attempt to destroy the role of the individual and replace it with the role of the masses. Because of this, Jews turn into an enzyme for the decomposition of entire peoples and races, and they gradually destroy the entire human culture. Marxism is a Jewish policy aimed at systematically destroying the role of the individual in all spheres of human life and replacing it with the role of the majority.
Hence the cult of the leader, to whom the nation must obey, and the leader must bear full responsibility to the nation. However, it never occurred to Hitler that in practice the nation has no real tools to control its leader. In Hitler's view, the principle of chieftaincy or Führerism implied the complete elimination of representative authorities. Only advisory bodies that will help the leader. At all levels, from the highest to the local communities, there will be leaders at various levels who will listen to the advice of advisory bodies. They will be taken into account, but they can make decisions alone and, accordingly, are accountable to the supreme leader Führer. Democracy, Hitler believed, is very harmful because it gives access to power to mediocrity and, conversely, suppresses outstanding personalities. And no doubt he considered himself an outstanding person. At least since his mid-20s, Hitler was convinced that he definitely stood out from the grey masses and believed in his historical mission, and this belief grew over time. From the very beginning of his political career, Hitler aimed to create the Third Reich. This is usually traditionally explained as follows. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation during the Middle Ages and early modern times. The Second Reich was the Hohenzollern Empire, and the Third Reich was Hitler's Nazi state. But there is other evidence, for example, from Otto Strasser, who writes that in 1920 Hitler called the German Hohenzollern Empire the First Reich, and that it existed from 1871 to 1988. The Second Reich is the interwar Weimar Republic, and the Third Reich is me, he said. Well, just like Louis XIV with his famous saying, the state is me. Hitler's anti-Semitism. This was known from the very beginning of his career, and he always emphasized this.
The existence of a Jew becomes a parasite on the lives of other peoples. The characteristics of cunning, intelligence, dexterity, fraud, and treachery are rooted in the character of his nation and serve as his weapon. Its ultimate goal is denationalization, the disorderly mixing of other peoples, the humiliation of the racial value of superior peoples, and the domination of the entire racial mixture by eradicating the national intelligentsia and replacing it with representatives of their own nation. The end of the Jewish world struggle, therefore, will always be bloody Bolshevization. After the successful revolution in Russia, Jews completely destroyed the boundaries of order, morality, and customs, and abolished marriage as a high institution. Instead, they announced general copulations, with the aim of dispelling general human confusion through chaotic bastardization.
To be honest, it has already taken the form of a real mania and obsession. Despite the fact that at that time the Jews did not have their own state, as Israel, as an independent state, would emerge only after World War II. Although Jewish political movements were extremely divided, there was a wide spectrum, from anarchists to Zionists. Despite the fact that different states had their own Jewish forces, parties, circles, and organizations, meaning that they did not form a large cohesive international community, Hitler believed in a worldwide conspiracy that harmed all of humanity. Here is an example of his direct speech from October 1920, a time when Hitler was virtually unknown throughout Germany.
The reality is the Jews. Look at the Jewish communist Marx and the Jewish capitalist Rathenau. All evil comes from the Jews who defile and pollute the world. As soon as I found out who they were, as soon as I recognized them, I started looking at every passerby on the street to determine whether they were Jewish or not. Jews control the social democratic press. Their goal is to destroy the nation and destroy differences between races. Jews are at the head of the labor movement and claim to improve the fate of workers. In fact, they seek to turn them into slaves, to kill their patriotism and honor in order to establish an international dictatorship of Jewry. Their organization is sophisticated and omnipresent. They have agents in all ministries. They pull the strings in the highest circles of the country.
Thus, in his anti-Semitism, Hitler was convinced that he was acting as a benefactor for all of humanity, and he held this view until his death. Even in April of 1945, when the fighting was already underway near Berlin, and when Hitler's suicide was a few weeks away. In one of the transcripts noted by Martin Bormann, Hitler stated that in the future humanity would be grateful to him for the extermination of the Jews of Germany and Central Europe. Well, here I must say that Hitler's maniacal views found a certain response in a society where the traditions of everyday anti-Semitism were very old. However, Hitler was able to escalate anti-Semitic sentiment to the maximum and turn Jews into real scapegoats. Who else but left-wing politicians could be blamed for all the problems of the society of that time? However, in Hitler's 1920 writings, there is no mention of the need for total genocide of all Jews. Or completely exterminate all Marxists, but there is a reference to the need for mass repression. In Mein Kampf, he regrets that at the beginning of the First World War the Germans did not dare to suffocate 12 to 15,000 Jewish leaders, speculators, usurers, and liars with poisonous gases. From 12 to 15,000, and a total of 500,000 of the Jewish population of Germany at the time. Then, if this had been done, all the sacrifices of the German people at the fronts would not have been in vain. And in the future, after coming to power, he dreamed of creating a national tribunal that would shoot several tens of thousands of people guilty of organizing the November Revolution of 1918, not only to punish them but also to intimidate all other supporters of the revolution forever. In general, he wrote openly that any means are real and justified to achieve the goal of their party, and all victims are the same. It is also worth emphasizing that Hitler and the Nazis in general constantly juggled the concepts of race and ethnicity, never providing a generally accepted precise definition. At the same time, they often used the word race as a synonym for people, or a whole group of peoples. For example, the Jewish race, the Slavic race, the Germanic race, the Nordic race, the Western or Eastern race. And what about Hitler's foreign policy plans? A lot has been written about this in Mein Kampf in Book 2. The main concept for him was the struggle, but the struggle for what? For life and living space. He absolutely despised international law and considered it something that imposed restrictions and prevented him from realizing his intentions. He has a famous phrase, "Anyone who does not want to fight does not deserve the right to live." That is why he constantly spoke about natural selection, the right of the strongest, and was convinced of the existence of higher and lower races. In general, for him, politics is either preparing for war or waging war itself. Hitler wrote extensively about the living space needed to fulfill the needs of the nation and to live a quality, prosperous life. There is an interesting point here. Many researchers have noticed that Hitler was a supporter of technological progress, especially in the military sphere. But in his delusion about the need for living space for Germans, he lived in the categories of pre-industrial society, that is, the kind of society that existed in antiquity, the Middle Ages, or early modern times. The area of modern Germany. Germany is much smaller than the pre-war Third Reich and the Hohenzollern Empire, but its population is much larger. But the country lives successfully, is one of the most developed in Europe, and does not need any living space. But, according to Hitler, some countries have conquered too much territory and, accordingly, have too many resources. Other states have not done so, and they are suffocating from their borders, experiencing overpopulation, and because of this, they cannot feed themselves. Undoubtedly, he considered Germany to be an overpopulated country. That is why Hitler wrote that wars are inevitable, but they are wars for life. This is a form of natural selection. Kill a weaker neighbor to take his territory, property and live better. To provide for descendants.
The National Socialist movement will always determine its foreign policy based on the need to secure the space necessary for the life of our people. It does not use Germanization or Teutonization, but only the expansion of its nation. You will never see in the conquered, so-called Germanized Czechs or Poles a national strengthening, let alone an ethnic strengthening, only a racial weakening of our people.
In other words, as early as the 1930s, Hitler argued for the need for the Germans to conquer foreign territories, but I emphasize that this was without any Germanization of the conquered peoples. It follows that these conquered peoples must either be physically destroyed or deported, or forced to work. They were forced to work for the victors, i.e., reduced to the position of a subjugated population, a subordinate labor force, even without the right to dissolve into the dominant nation, the Germans. Hitler wrote that traditionally, historically, Germany had a weak navy and few colonies, and after the First World War there were no colonies at all. Therefore, Germany is not capable of fighting the United Kingdom, the ruler of the seas. It is much wiser not to challenge Britain from an initial losing position, and to direct German expansionism in the continental direction. Europe, Eurasia as a whole. First of all, to expand the living space to the east at the expense of Russia. He always wrote Russia, not the Soviet Union. He used only the phrase Russia. Why? Because there is a lower population density than in Germany, and the tradition of successful life of German colonists has existed for several centuries. And for this, Germany must have powerful ground forces capable of seizing the living space. Of course, the living space cannot be secured peacefully, so it is necessary to militarize German society so that the army is the main powerful force that can conquer these territories. Germany was not satisfied with the League of Nations because it was run by the winners of World War I. First of all, France and the United Kingdom, which, on the contrary, are interested in weakening Germany, so Hitler wrote that it is necessary to find allies who, like the Germans, want to break the Versailles-Washington system of international relations and build a new world. Hitler considered France to be his country's eternal, most dangerous, and main enemy, which acted in alliance with Great Britain. Why? One way or another, France has always acted in anti-German coalitions and has attacked German lands 29 times over the past 300 years. At the same time, looking to the future, Hitler saw the United States as the next major competitor for Germany and Europe as a whole. Here is another important point from Hitler's ideology. Hitler was disgusted, frankly disgusted, by the growth of the black population in France and mixed marriages between blacks and whites.
Europe is facing a danger of incredible proportions. The French discolor their blood to preserve the character of a numerically large nation. That is why France will be a perpetual troublemaker in the world until one day it learns a decisive and important lesson.
In addition, no one has better defined the nature of French vanity than Schopenhauer himself in his own statement: Africa has its monkeys, Europe its French. Who did Hitler see as Germany's main allies? First of all, it was Italy. Why Italy? They say that it is France's main competitor in the struggle for the Mediterranean basin, and therefore will never be able to act together with France. This brings the positions of Italy and Germany closer together. He also saw that Italy, like Germany, is a young nation-state. Let me remind you that Germany united in 1871, Italy in 1860, and finally in 1970, when the Papal States were added. It was almost simultaneously. As Hitler said, Italy, like Germany, suffers from overpopulation. And the country also needs a living space, and this space is the Balkans, the South Slavic territories. Former Yugoslavia. So, the direction of expansion of the Germans and Italians is completely different, they have no competition here. Hitler called Benito Mussolini a brilliant statesman who best defends the national interests of his homeland. And Hitler called Fascist Italy the Third Rome. That is, it was not about Muscovy at all. For him, the Third Rome was Fascist Italy, and he obviously considered ancient Rome to be the first Rome. The Roman Empire. The Second Rome is the medieval period when the Pope had a serious political influence. And the Third Rome is the time of Mussolini's fascist dictatorship. Hitler called the accession of 9 million Austrian Germans to the German state his main and primary mission. And that's why. He always believed that the continued existence of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was an extremely undesirable thing, so even after the defeat of the Central Powers, he perceived the collapse of Austria-Hungary as a positive event. He was always very critical of the alliance between Berlin and Vienna in the First World War, believing that this alliance only weakened Berlin, only dragged it down, and was in the interests of Vienna, not Berlin. Hitler wrote, "This alliance led to the conflict between Germany and Italy in World War I because the Italians had unresolved problems with Austria-Hungary. There was a struggle for territory, and because of this, the Germans had to fight against the Italians, who were allies of Austria-Hungary." He saw Germany's foreign policy ideal as an alliance with Italy and, in addition, with Great Britain. And, in his opinion, such an alliance could effectively confront France. And it would in no way prevent German expansion to the east against the Soviet Union. And in the future, such a powerful alliance of Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom will be able to compete successfully with the United States. Among secondary allies, he names Spain. Why Spain? Because it also competes with France, but very locally, in northern Africa, where the Spanish colonies were then. And Hungary. Because it seems to be gravitating toward an alliance with Fascist Italy and is very hostile to the newly created Yugoslavia. So, the Germans must first defeat France, and then they must turn their attention to the east. From a historical perspective, we know that this happened. France was defeated in 1940. And in 1940, Hitler launched a military campaign against the Soviet Union. Already in the 1920s, he believed that any understanding with the Bolsheviks was impossible as long as their political regime existed, since they were striving for a world communist revolution and the enslavement of Germans through it. Hitler believed that the victory of Bolshevism in Germany would lead to the establishment of a Jewish dictatorship. Just as it exists today in Russia, he wrote. In addition, he believed that even if the possibility of an alliance between Germany and the USSR was theoretically possible, this alliance would not help Germany fight against European countries. He treated the Slavs with extreme contempt and wrote that they were not capable of their own statehood. He emphasized that the Russian Empire was actually dominated by ethnic Germans, and now the Soviet Union is dominated by Jews.
Slavism is generally deprived of any organizational abilities, and thus of state-building and state-preserving abilities. Remove from Slavism all elements that are not purely Slavic, and it immediately risks disintegrating as a state. Such a state will be a source of eternal unrest and perpetual danger. Thus, the fate of giant land regions will become unclear.